the inheritance they thought I'd share. I never thought money would be the thing that tore apart what little family I had left. When my daughter died, grief hollowed me out in ways I didn't know were possible. Nothing prepares you to bury your own child. And when she left behind 2 young children, my world shifted entirely. My husband and I weren't just grieving parents anymore. We were guardians in every way that mattered, especially financially. From the moment the funeral ended, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. My grandchildren would never struggle if I had any say in it. Their father, my son-in-law, wasn't a bad man, at least not at first. He loved my daughter and he loved the kids. But love and money are very different things, and I've lived long enough to know that good intentions don't protect children from bad financial outcomes, especially after remarriage. My daughter had been young when she passed. She'd set up a small trust for the kids, but it wasn't much, certainly not enough for college, let alone the rising costs of housing, healthcare, and career training in the U.S. economy. My husband and I reviewed the documents quietly, late at night, spreadsheets open, inflation calculators pulled up. The numbers were brutal. So we made a decision. We would create a private financial plan for our grandchildren, not for the household, not for their father, not for any future stepchildren, for them. We started shifting money carefully, deliberately. High-yield savings accounts, long-term index funds, conservative growth portfolios balanced against market volatility. We accounted for tuition increases, housing trends, and career flexibility. We weren't just saving money, we were engineering freedom. And we told no one. Some people will already judge that decision. I understand why. But here's the thing most people don't realize until it's too late. When blended families mix finances without clarity, children from a first marriage almost always lose. My son-in-law remarried a few years later. His new wife brought children of her own into the marriage, and then they had another child together. Overnight, our grandchildren went from being the center of his world to being part of a financial equation that had tripled in complexity. New mouths to feed, new futures to fund, same income. That's when my instincts went on high alert. We never interfered, never commented, never tried to influence spending, but we watched. Birthday gifts grew smaller, college conversations became vague, the phrase, "we'll figure it out later," started appearing more often, and every time my husband and I looked at each other and said nothing, because we already had it figured out. As the years passed, we continued funding the accounts quietly. Market dips didn't scare us. We were playing the long game. We diversified. We rebalanced annually. We consulted fiduciary advisors, not salespeople. Every move was intentional. When our oldest grandchild turned 18, we sat her down privately. We explained everything. Her eyes widened when she saw the numbers, not because it made her rich, but because it gave her options. College without debt, trade school without stress, the ability to say no to bad jobs and yes to opportunities. We told her the money was hers, but with education came responsibility. She understood immediately, and, per our request, she said nothing to her father. Some might call that secrecy. I call it protection. It wasn't until our youngest graduated high school, years later, that the truth came out. He chose not to attend traditional college, opting instead for a specialized training path aligned with his career goals, a practical decision, a smart one. And when he transferred a portion of his funds into a high-interest savings account to support that path, the questions started. That's when the storm hit. But at that moment, right before everything exploded, I still believed we'd done the right thing, that protecting children financially didn't require permission, that intentions mattered more than appearances. I didn't know yet how much resentment money could unlock. The dinner budget that exposed entitlement. When I went to bed that night, I didn't feel guilty. I felt tired, the kind of tired that comes from realizing you're being quietly taken advantage of. I kept replaying my son's words in my head. Can't you just make your guest happy? Guest. Carmela had been living in my house for weeks, eating our food, using our utilities, sleeping under our roof rent-free. And yet somehow I was the villain for saying no to steak. That realization hit me harder than anything else. This wasn't about groceries anymore. This was about money, boundaries, and entitlement. The next morning, I sat down with my coffee and reviewed my monthly expenses like I always did. Utilities were up. Grocery spending had jumped almost 35% since Carmela moved in. It wasn't just the steak and seafood. It was name-brand snacks, specialty ingredients, spontaneous, I'll just run to the store trips that added up fast. I wasn't struggling financially, but I wasn't careless either. I'd worked for decades to maintain a stable budget, especially in a household with 6 people. What bothered me most wasn't the cost, it was the assumption that my card was unlimited, that my boundaries were optional. Later that day, my son confronted me again. He said Carmela felt awkward and unappreciated after the budget conversation. I listened calmly, then asked him a simple question. How much have you contributed to groceries since she moved in? Silence. He had a full-time job, no rent, no utilities, no grocery bills, and yet he expected me to finance elaborate meals without question. I explained very clearly that if Carmela wanted to cook, which I appreciated, it needed to be within a set budget, or he could pay for it himself. Financial boundaries weren't personal attacks, they were basic respect. That's when I realized something important. My son wasn't angry because Carmela was embarrassed. He was angry because the money tap had been tightened. From a financial perspective, the situation was simple. If you're not contributing financially, you don't control the spending. Period. I wasn't running a restaurant. I was running a household. That evening, I sat both of them down. No raised voices, no drama, just facts. I explained our weekly grocery budget, showed them past spending, and laid out clear expectations. If Carmela wanted to continue cooking, she'd have a fixed weekly allowance. If they wanted steak, seafood, or specialty meals, they were welcome to buy them with their own money. Carmela looked surprised, not offended, just inexperienced. She admitted she'd never had to budget groceries before. Her mom handled everything, and money was always tight, so she assumed if someone offered a card, it meant freedom. That conversation shifted my perspective slightly. She wasn't malicious, she was inexperienced. My son, however, was defensive. He accused me of making everything about money. I reminded him that everything already is about money, whether people acknowledge it or not. Rent, food, utilities, security. Adults who ignore finances end up dependent on others, and I wasn't raising dependence. That night, I updated my household budget and created clear categories for food, utilities, and shared expenses. I also made a decision. Once my son moved out in January, financial assistance would end. Love didn't mean unlimited funding. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is teach financial responsibility. In the days that followed, things changed. Carmela started planning meals more carefully, grocery trips became less frequent, costs stabilized, tension dropped. Money, once addressed openly, stopped being a silent wedge in the house. I didn't feel like the villain anymore. I felt like a parent doing her job, not just providing shelter, but teaching the reality of financial boundaries. Because if they couldn't respect a grocery budget, how would they manage rent, emergencies, or real life? This wasn't about steak. It was about learning that generosity has limits and entitlement has consequences. The inheritance they were never meant to touch. By the time my son-in-law finally learned about the money, it was already too late to undo anything, and that fact alone told me I'd made the right decision all those years ago. The money had never been about favoritism, it was about intention. My daughter had passed away when her children were still young, and from that moment on, my husband and I made a promise. Whatever we could do to protect her children's futures, we would. Quietly, carefully, strategically. We didn't trust emotions where money was concerned. After my son-in-law remarried, things changed quickly. His new wife brought children into the marriage, and soon there were more mouths, more expenses, more fairness conversations. We watched from the sidelines as our grandchildren slowly became just part of a blended unit. Not mistreated, but no longer prioritized either. That's when we formalized our plan. We worked with an estate attorney and a financial planner to create individual trusts for each grandchild. The funds were invested conservatively at first: municipal bonds, index funds, blue chip stocks. Nothing flashy, just growth, compounding quietly in the background while life went on. We deliberately chose not to disclose it. Not out of spite, not out of secrecy, but because money changes behavior. We had seen it before. When people know there's a financial safety net, they take risks that aren't theirs to take. They reallocate resources that don't belong to them. They start counting money that was never promised to them. We weren't going to let that happen to our grandchildren. When our oldest grandson turned 18, she gained access to her trust. She handled it with maturity and discretion. She paid for school, saved responsibly, and never told her father. That alone validated every choice we'd made. But when our youngest turned 18, things unfolded differently. He decided college wasn't his path. Instead, he wanted to pursue specialized training in a technical field, one with a clear return on investment. We supported him fully. He accessed his trust, opened a high-interest savings account, and began planning his future like an adult. That's when the secret came out. The conversation that followed was explosive. My son-in-law was hurt. His wife was furious. They accused us of undermining their household, of creating inequality, of cutting out the other children. They said if they had known, they would have planned differently. That's exactly why we didn't tell them. Because what they really meant was they would have spent less on our grandchildren and redirected their own money elsewhere, which would mean our money was no longer just helping our grandchildren. It would be subsidizing a household that wasn't ours to finance. That was never the deal. From a financial standpoint, this wasn't emotional. It was logical. Trust funds are not family slush funds. They're instruments of protection, and transparency isn't always ethical when it enables exploitation. My son-in-law demanded explanations. I gave him facts. The money was ours. The intent was specific. The beneficiaries were clear. We were not responsible for balancing outcomes across households created after our daughter's death. That boundary enraged him. Our youngest grandson moved in with us shortly afterward, not because we pushed him, but because the tension became unbearable. We provided stability, structure, and something increasingly rare in modern families: financial clarity without guilt. As the dust settled, I realized something important. Money doesn't just reveal values, it tests them. And when tested, we stood firm. Because protecting your descendants isn't selfish, it's responsible. And sometimes the most loving financial decision is the one you never announce. The inheritance they weren't supposed to touch. By the time the argument reached its peak, I realized this was no longer just about money. It was about control, entitlement, and rewritten narratives. My son-in-law kept insisting that if I had just told him earlier, things would have been different. That line stuck with me because it revealed the truth he didn't want to admit. He believed he was entitled to plan around our money. For years, my husband and I had been quietly preparing for our grandchildren's futures. Not loudly, not performatively, we did it deliberately, choosing low-risk investments, high-yield savings, and long-term growth strategies that wouldn't be affected by market volatility. We had one goal. When our grandchildren became adults, they would have options: college, business, training, housing, choices their mother would have wanted them to have. What that money was never meant to be was household income. It was never supposed to subsidize a blended family dynamic where our grandchildren became secondary to new priorities. And yet, the moment that account was revealed, everything shifted. My son-in-law began framing the narrative as fairness. Fairness to the stepchildren, fairness to his wife, fairness to the household. But fairness is an interesting word because fairness assumes shared ownership, and that money was never his, never the household's, and never communal. It was protected, earmarked, and intentionally kept separate. I sat across from him at the kitchen table as he laid out hypothetical scenarios. If we had known, we could have redirected funds. We wouldn't have struggled as much. The kids could have been treated equally. Each sentence translated to the same truth. He would have spent differently if he knew my grandchildren were financially secure. And that, right there, was exactly why we never told him. From a financial planning perspective, secrecy wasn't cruelty, it was protection. Estate planning professionals call it controlled distribution. You don't reveal future assets when doing so changes behavior in ways that undermine the asset's purpose. Had we disclosed the funds earlier, our grandchildren's inheritance would have quietly turned into indirect support for an entirely different family unit. And the numbers backed it up. When my youngest grandson moved in with us, we reviewed household expenses. We noticed patterns immediately, how resources were allocated, how priorities shifted, and how quiet, equal treatment often meant quiet sacrifice from our grandchildren. The money would not have lasted. It would have been diluted. My son-in-law's wife accused us of favoritism, but favoritism implies choice between equals. These were my daughter's children. This wasn't favoritism, it was responsibility. The trust was an extension of parental duty after loss, financially, morally, and emotionally. What hurt the most wasn't the accusations, it was the realization that transparency, in this case, would have been weaponized. My son-in-law didn't ask how the money was invested, how we planned for inflation, or how we protected it against market downturns. He asked how it could have helped him. That's when I understood something critical. People who are upset about not knowing your finances are usually upset because they wanted access, not understanding. By the end of that week, my husband and I met with our financial advisor. We tightened the trust structure, clarified distribution language, and added legal protections to ensure no future interference. Our grandchildren's funds were secured against pressure, guilt, and manipulation. And emotionally, I felt lighter because financial boundaries aren't cruel, they're necessary, especially when grief, blended families, and entitlement collide. I didn't regret a single decision. The money had done exactly what it was meant to do, protect our grandchildren's future, even if it upset people who thought that future should have included them. The money we never owed. By the time everything finally came to a head, I realized something painful but clarifying. No matter how carefully you plan to protect money for children, adults will always feel entitled to it if they believe it could benefit them. My husband and I had never doubted our decision to set aside money exclusively for our grandchildren. What shook us was how quickly gratitude turned into resentment once the secret was revealed. My son-in-law sat across from us at the dining table, his jaw tight, his new wife pacing behind him. The tension wasn't about love or loss anymore. It was about numbers, about what they thought we owed them. He kept repeating the same argument. If we'd known, we could have planned better. What he meant was clear. If we had told them about the trust, they would have redirected their own money elsewhere, and our grandchildren would have quietly subsidized a household that wasn't theirs. That was the moment I stopped feeling conflicted. I calmly explained what we had done and why. The trust was not income. It wasn't family money. It wasn't inheritance meant to be split evenly among unrelated children. It was a future fund, created to replace the support their mother would never be able to give them. Money meant for education, housing, or starting a business, not for offsetting someone else's parenting budget. He accused us of favoritism. I corrected him. This isn't favoritism. This is responsibility. From a financial standpoint, secrecy had been the only protection. Had we disclosed the trust earlier, our grandchildren's father could have reduced his contributions, leaned harder into shared household spending, or, worst of all, pressured the kids emotionally once they were old enough to understand. Money changes power dynamics. Always has, always will. What hurt most wasn't the argument, it was seeing how quickly our grandchildren became resources in someone else's eyes. Our youngest moved in with us shortly after. He didn't want to be in the middle anymore. He was 18, financially literate, and already thinking long term. Together, we went over interest projections, conservative investment growth, and withdrawal strategies. We talked about compounding, inflation, and why rushing into big purchases could erase years of discipline. Watching him take ownership of his future reminded me why we'd done this in the first place. The older grandchild, already independent, continued forward quietly. She didn't flaunt the money, she didn't loan it out. She used it strategically. Tuition first, then a down payment fund. No drama, no guilt, just stability. That contrast told me everything I needed to know. My son-in-law eventually stopped pushing, but the relationship changed permanently. His wife never forgave us, and I learned a lesson I wish more families understood. Not all money needs to be disclosed, and not all transparency is virtuous. Sometimes privacy is protection. From a financial perspective, we had done everything right. Funds were legally structured, access was age-gated, no shared control, no emotional leverage, no strings attached. And yet, we were still blamed. Would I do it differently if I could go back? No, because the goal was never to make adults comfortable. It was to make children secure. Money doesn't just build futures, it exposes intentions. And once you see those intentions clearly, you stop explaining yourself. Do you believe families are entitled to know about money set aside for children, or is privacy sometimes the smartest financial boundary? If this story made you think twice about family money, inheritance, or financial boundaries, subscribe now. We turn real-life stories into powerful finance lessons that protect your future, your peace, and your wealth. New stories every week. Don't miss the next one.